initiate as well. Record on this computer. All right. Hello, hello. Nice to meet you. I'm Dan.
Nice to meet you, Dan. I'm YssaH. I'm
Yes,
YssaH.
and you've been working on plasma activation.
Exactly. I started in my when I started to unfold all my memories in Egypt. I started remembering a lot of things um, related to how the body functions in a deep scale, very deep scale. By this, I mean at a genetic one, biological one, like everything that is related to the biology, and also how all this information was encoded in the glyphs. And then I started connecting it to the Sumerians, to the Mayans, to all the ancient civilizations that they were pointing out to the same information in like reading a book, like reading a biology book.
Yes. Well, you know that we've been measuring brainwave signatures, flameinmind.com, for many years. And then we measure HRV in the breath. And the conclusion was that the harmonic cascade that's initiated, basic golden ratio, creates implosive compression. And as in the Egyptian Ba from the Ka, what we think is that during that compression, the transverse electromagnetic component comes out the pine cone squirt gun as more coherent longitudinal EMF, and that embeds in an array called the Ba from the Ka, or the Kesjan body, or the rainbow light body. So we have a very specific idea about how the plasma body actually unpacks, and we believe we can prove that that same cascade of compression measurably, and we know the frequencies, triggers lucid dreaming and clairvoyance, and actually what is the soul. So we have some very specific ideas about this.
Yes, when I started to tune, for instance, into all Akhenaten information, and they said that he was, all about the sun cold, and I was saying, like, there's gotta be more than that. All these beings with such an amazing technology, wisdom, how can they be adoring, you know, the sun instead of life and nature and the essence, the divine essence within everything? So then I started to see how they would show the coherent states of this circle that for most people is the solar disk, and how in many of the glyphs they would show a disk, which was just a circle, and a sphere, or the Aten, which actually the original meaning of Aten is not sun, is a sphere or orb. So then, and the way that they would represent it was as a sphere, the shape. So
Hmm.
then I started putting all together, and I said, it's the solar flares. That's why they related it to the sun. But it's talking about the plasma coming from the sun. And then I started going deep. And then I said, it's about the plasma that we are capable to activate within.
Well,
So
this is beautiful and a rather poetic introduction. We think we can take the physics further after, Atun also meaning sun god or at one, that advanced shaman all know what it's like to go through the heart of the sun. They say it's cool and inviting and an eyeball, and we've worked with many such solar shaman. And then when the clairvoyants, Leadbeater and Besant, who later proved in the physics literature that they accurately discovered subatomic particles inside perceptual quarks. When they investigated the heart of the sun, they saw what they called HUNUH, which was 7 spins outside, 5 spins inside, and they investigated the same and find the exact structure in the human heart, and we know there's 7 layers in the muscle. And then they discovered the same in the heart of hydrogen. And we now know what that means. The 7 spins and 5 spins is actually 7 spins tetracubic symmetry embedded inside dodecacosa, which literally is simply Platonic charge collapse. So if you see perfected charge collapse, you're seeing the sun's heart, the human heart, and hydrogen heart having the same exact physics. In fact, the atomic table is nothing other than Platonic charge collapse. So effectively, we know how plasma grows up. It implodes, embeds into an array at the center. The heart of the sun is a good example.
exactly. And now that you mentioned the heart of the sun and all this holofractographic reality, it takes me to the black ball that you also mentioned, the eye black ball, which is the black hole in the sun. you know, and not the black hole as we had interpreted it, you know, as this force bringing all the all the mass and all the energy, and you know, like just uh feeding from it. It's more, and it has more layers, like these 7 layers, and even it has plasma in the event horizon, which it makes it very stable. So now that you also mentioned the 7, it brings me to, I always have said that the Earth is an area code 7. If each one of the planets in the solar system and everywhere has a specific area code, like if you want to call to France or to England or to Mexico, you dial a specific area code. The area code for the Earth would be 7 due to the Schumann resonance. That's why all these 7, the 7 alchemic metals, the 7 colors of the rainbow, the 7 days of the week, and the 7 days of the Genesis.
I mean, not to interrupt, but from a physics perspective, the 7 spins of the symmetry of the HUNUH was very clear. It represented the 7 spin axes of symmetry of tetracube, which is also the physics of the origin of Hebrew and heart muscle. And so the 7 spin axes, and actually the 7.83 hertz of the Schumann is relatively unrelated to that, actually. But what is true is that the Schumann harmonic cascade then fits the charge collapse equation called Planckfire.com, which is the only meaning of the black hole you speak about. That actually, since, from Planckfire.com, Planckkphire, Planckfire.com, we proved hundreds of physical variables are accurately predicted by Planck times golden ratio to integer exponents, including the radii of hydrogen, and obviously the Schumann harmonics of the Earth. So what that black hole is crystal clear. What the black hole is when the charge implodes and collapses precisely tuned to the Planck threshold. Then and only then can it be distributed into the longitudinal array, which we now know, we've proven with Bearden, is the physics of what gravity waves and the gravity grid is made of. And we now know that's how telepathy and ancestor memory and lucid dreaming and clairvoyance propagates as well. The same longitudinal array with the same frequency signature. So the 7.83 hertz actually does identify, that is the phone number, because that's the frequency signature of charge collapse, which is exactly why that is the only definition of the brainwave harmonics that make bliss, the alpha to beta to gamma cascade, is that charge collapse only.
This is why when I see the 7.83, that, and maybe I relate to it like in a very ordinal way, yet it's like this base frequency that actually is tuning into our brain, is tuning into all forms of life, and that translates to the tones. Actually, the Mayans had got it very clear through the patterns of the 7 and the 20 and the 14, which actually they would consider as the 13. But that's
and if you take Planck's times golden ratio, you land at 7.83 and 13 and 20, actually, and 50, by the way. So the Schumann harmonics are exactly virtually predicted within from 7.29 to 7.83. That cascade is identified by Planck times golden ratio, which means charge collapse identifies, and that's why humans get bliss only when their brain waves do exactly that, because it literally embeds you into the radio of the longitudinal array.
Exactly. Now that we're speaking about the brain waves, I was listening to one of your videos, and you were talking about the difference in the languages that the male and the female would have at some point. And then I started to connect it to my research in the brain and how perhaps we were receiving different frequencies within each one of our hemispheres inherently until we actually do our inner work and enable all these 7 layers in the heart, and then activate, or like through a very specific process, then we activate our plasma body. And that also led me to something else. There is an element in our brain that I will call it the entropy part of our brain, which is the endarestiform nucleus. This is a part in our left brain, in our left hemisphere, that is only in that side. And as we know that negantropy could also be, well, how I perceive it, through a very symmetrical, harmonic, generating that vacuum fluctuation force, then if we have a specific mass here, and then we have another specific mass here, then it gets to generate a different frequency inherently. So if we start to play with that, that would be the effect of alpha waves and all the research that you have been doing, then it would end up tuning into, and that endarestiform nucleus actually perform another function or evolve.
You know, as an electrical engineer, I mean, I love your approach to the poetry here. First of all, it's necessary to be clear. The Aboriginals had a different language, emanate, emissary, as Anton Parks documents. The Aboriginal shaman had a different language between the male and the female, specifically because that was Draco, Alpha Draconis, the Siakar of the Draco. And their war of the sexes is how they lost their soul, basically. But how to apply that to the hemispheres of the brain is, you know, so when you go across Australia and heal the war of the sexes between the shaman, you get rainstorms because the desertification we know in physics is caused indirectly by patriarchy. That's a whole nother beautiful conversation. But applying that to the hemispheres of the brain, as maybe one being more male than female, is probably simplistic. What we can say is it's electrically relatively clear that one hemisphere is more centripetal generally than the other, identifying the intuitive versus the rational brain, actually. But the whole important principle here is the amount by which the electric field of the brain is centripetal is the only actual measurement of how conscious you are. You can measure how implosive your field is, and that tells you how conscious you are literally by measurement. It's not subjective. And the Dracos, by the way, it feels like a vice. The point is, the only thing that makes that field implosive and centripetal is when the right and left hemisphere phase conjugate. And that means we know for sure that the alpha to gamma cascade golden ratio and octave for brainwaves that creates human bliss requires that the right hemisphere and left hemisphere be 180 degrees out of phase for exactly that reason, that only phase conjugation implodes and lets charge go down the drain through the center black hole, and that is the origin of centripetal force and the only origin of negantropy.
Beautiful, thank you. That takes me to, for instance, how I see reality. One of the forms how I perceive it is through geometries. It takes me to how the blind kids see, the ones that were born blind. And so when I tune into this form of reality, I see that each one of us have a unique geometrical pattern, which is the communion of our gravitational field and our electromagnetic field. So when this...
Well, just not to interrupt, but it's clear physics is now, at least Tom Bearden is clear by equation, that the gravity field is nothing more or less than that longitudinal array, which we embed in when our brainwaves implode. The only physics of remote viewing, astral travel, and actually the physics of ancestor memories, the coherence of that longitudinal array, which we know by equation is the only substance of gravity waves. So the songline dreaming track, we know exactly. And that's why we know the frequencies to trigger lucid dreaming, which is the only measure if you're going to have a soul.
Yes, yes. Therefore, when you start to bring in your geometrical body, which would be like your blueprint, your fingerprint, you know, that is unique, then we are capable to unfold it in a double torus, generating that centripetal force and then generating the vacuum. So in 1,440 degrees. So That's actually one of the, yeah, exactly. That's one of the things that I do. And that's also why I understood it was very important to activate the inner plasma body first in order to get the full spectrum of all this potential. And another thing that I loved, and I want to ask you, because I love how you relate all the waves, like the gamma waves being so important for all
Mm.
this process. There are also two other waves that have come to the field, which are the lambda and the epsilon. How would you relate those two?
Yeah, I've been measuring brain waves for 30 years, and I have a whole series of hardware inventions, first BlissTuner, now flameinmind.com, and we've measured thousands of brain waves around the planet for many years. And of course, we know for sure that, well, for example, in my case, my Kundalini allows me to create very low delta and theta, particularly delta, often, which gives me some clairaudience, and I hear ancestors actually quite often. But however, my Kundalini doesn't reach up to gamma very often, I'll be honest, which means I'm not a particularly good lucid dreamer yet. I need to work on it, obviously. Now, the epsilon and lambda actually are pretty rarefied in this conversation. First of all, I don't know if you know, the lambda waves defines a spectrum 100 to 200 hertz. And there's probably only 1 in a million people that could actually make that even replicably or dependably. And although reaching close to there in the 40 to 60 hertz region with the gamma region is actually a turning point in the ability to lucid dream and astral travel, remote view, and even teleport. And we know why, because it increases the resolution of the foci when the cascade implodes to Planck. So if you can't make the 40 to 80 hertz gamma, your chances of good lucid dreaming are less. So it's a very good training. And by the way, kids who imagine themselves in beautiful nature can often make some gamma. But the much higher frequencies now, that epsilon and the 100 to 200 frequency lambda is very, very rarely measured, I would say. And it's true, though, people that can reach up there, and
Yeah.
they even used to call it Tibetan gamma, people that can reach up there would have powerful, powerful. Now, regarding epsilon, 0.1 to 0.5 hertz, I would say that our most brainwave systems can't measure below 0.5 hertz because for them it's noise. However, that being said, I will give you an example. Our Therify.net plasma system can't get below about, I don't know, 5 hertz or something. Whereas our plasmafire.com gets right down to 0.1 hertz, and it is more powerful. And we know why, because when you can reach the super low frequencies, you get a handle on a much longer wave, literally the length of the memory. So, but that again is very little studied.
Yes. Well, now that you mention all the memory, like all this information popped up, because it's very interesting how memory can be quite related to all that emotional state, like being anchored a lot through emotions, this idea, sense. But yeah, then again, as you say, that's another beautiful topic. When you were saying about the Tibetan monks, they do, as you know, research, and it's beautiful how it's capable to reach that frequency when your heart is almost not beating. That it seems that you're dead, but you're not dead. You're just you left the body and
Well,
still we.
there's some science around that too. For example, after 30 years of intense Kundalini, and during intense Kundalini, you will stop breathing for many minutes at a time. And if you study the physics, what you realize is that what we call mind inhabits a central node of a conjugate array. So, for example, it's much easier to die if you're in a sacred space because the compression there enables you to embed in the array, and dying is quite fun. So the ability to get into that still point means that if you've got a low frequency cascade, both in the breath and in the brain waves, you've generated the kind of still point where phase conjugation does not need to be pumped with the breath. The reason the breath enables consciousness is because it pumps the phase conjugate implosion to enable that pump wave It's literally called a phase conjugate pump wave. It's how fire crystals work. And if the phase conjugate pump wave is working in other longer spectra, then obviously you don't need to breathe. So that's why the longer you inhabit the still point, the bigger the array you can inhabit. Like Daniel Brinkley, how long did the lightning bolt last that enabled him to become a superconductor and see everybody's memory and have a near-death experience? So, how long you inhabit the center of that lightning bolt, it's very cool in one sense, but in the other sense, it's a bit life-threatening. And so you only inhabit the lightning bolt as long as your inner voice tells you. But that's the meaning of why your breathing can stop, is because you don't need the breath if you have a phase conjugate array to embed in.
And thank you very much for mentioning this, because I was actually talking about this yesterday, that every time that I am in a very deep connection, my breath goes and I stay without breath. And it's like this voice, like, it's going to be okay, stay, 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 stay. Yeah, and each time is longer. So thank you for
Yeah.
mentioning that.
But
Yeah.
and also there is a risk that it's like doing the dervish turn. The master knows you have pure intention if you didn't get dizzy during the spin. Well, when you inhabit that implosive center point, first of all, the ability to come back, and also the ability to retain the mineral to water bond, which Kundalini lightning bolt stresses. So there are many reasons why the glands cannot withstand that. Uh, as with a gradual length of time increases. But you definitely want to listen to your intuition there, because you definitely are on that near-death threshold, which on the one hand is initiatory, but on the other hand,
Yes, yes, I have those experience. I mean, we could talk about that another time, but yeah, even my daughter brought me back,
yeah,
through.
that's right.
Yes.
She says, "Don't go, don't go. Hey, keep that silver thread."
Yes. And being conscious all the time, that's the beauty of it. Uh yeah,
It's why Lost Art of Resurrection, the famous Freddie Silva, was a very useful insight that the Templars would teach near-death experience. And when people learn to do near-death experience well, that form of initiation means their aura has touched something much larger, the Ba from the Ka, rainbow light body. And so they have much more context in their life decisions.
yes, yes, I agree. Well, now, so you relate a lot the plasma to the nine donuts,
Yes.
all these nine donuts coming together, and so I have my perception of why nine, yet I would love to know from you why nine? Why
Well,
nine?
actually, when they discovered that 9 plasma donuts above one another were the first to self-organize at Los Alamos Plasma Research Institute, then they realized they walked out in the backyard and saw the Aboriginal rock carvings, that the Aboriginals knew that already, is why you have 9 chakras and you act to above, and why there are 9 roofs of the pagoda, and there are 9 levels of Dante's Inferno, and the Greek 9 Ennead, and the Egyptian 9. It's the plasma self-organization moment when 9 toroids, one above the other, the cascade of frequencies becomes net implosive and literally self-organizing. So it's, for example, in the physics of Anak, the ancient Anunnaki, the politics, your name, your power was your number from 1 to 9, because that is literally the physics of the plasma body of the collective mind. So the plasma physics of 9 toroids, and all of that is published in detail with graphics from Los Alamos Plasma Physics at goldenmean.info/whale dreamers. And you'll see the graphics. We can dig them out now. And that is also why you have 9 golden ratio tetra shadows casting the 3D shadow, which is the three-dimensional Sri Yantra as well.
Thank you, because I'm amazed. As you say, I perceive life as poetry. I love science. I love science, and I also love arts. So when I take some information, for instance, a scientific fact, solid rock, and then I bring it to the the emotion, that artistic part to play with it, then, for instance, the nine comes to me as the nine is the only number that is replicated from the whole series, which is
That's
from
right. The
six.
numerology of 9 is very powerful. Yes, right.
Exactly. And it is
Symmetric.
showing us the torsion, the torsion of the six, and which actually I don't know if you saw an image that what became very famous about the photonic quantum entanglement, which is related to the yin and the yang. I can share with you a picture.
Well, but just to be clear, entanglement is only introduction to what entanglement perfected is, which is named phase conjugation, which is perfected by golden ratio at Planck. And that's what creates the longitudinal interferometry, the only physics of all action at a distance. So when conventional physics says entanglement enables action at a distance through wormholes, what they actually mean is phase conjugation to Planck embeds the longitudinal array. And when the longitudinal waves interferes with itself at a distance, it can resynthesize heat at a distance, which is the only introduction of any possible physics of all action at a distance, which Einstein called spooky because he didn't know what a gravitational wave or a longitudinal wave was.
Because he didn't took into consideration the Planck units. And
Well,
also,
actually, well, he didn't. There's a lot of information. He didn't know what a fractal was. Also, he didn't know what phase conjugation was. He didn't know how negantropy was eventually to be measured in phase conjugation and time reversal. In fact, I don't think he actually knew what time was. It's simply a name for relative rate of rotation. So space-time is not bent. It's just the rotation rate that changes when you accelerate. And then you can understand how phase conjugation creates negantropy in both time and space.
wow, that's interesting. I had known for that he was not very into the 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 Planck units, at least in his formulas. He didn't, bring it. Perhaps he knew it, but as you said, he was afraid, so
I
he
think it was
didn't.
after his
He,
time,
he
after
didn't
his time. But my new insight is that the Planck is specifically the threshold at which implosive compression converts transverse to longitudinal. And the reason Planck is the same for a million light years in all directions is not the Big Bang. That's crap. The reason it's the same is because all waves propagating past the speed of light use longitudinal interferometry, the only physics of gravity waves, and they can't share the array unless they agree. So that's why Planck is the same for a million light years in all directions, is because that is the threshold that allows electromagnetic compression to become coherent longitudinal propagation, the only physics of gravity waves. And that array, the smoking gun is that golden ratio is the dominant geometry of all orbital mechanics. And that fractality, most physicists agree is the cause of gravity, but they don't know that golden ratio is the climax form of fractality.
Yes, and well, now that you mentioned also the way that the main purpose of the quantum entanglement, like through the quantum tunneling, capable to project all the information at a
Yeah.
faster rate.
Entanglement is just an introduction to phase conjugation, but the average physicist does not know in a phase conjugate mirror how phase conjugation happens in the super dielectric barium strontium titanate. It's actually quite simple. The super permissive charge distribution in the super dielectric barium strontium titanate, the phase conjugate mirror, how the Olmecs called ancestors and how Nostradamus made the coding to call ancestors. The super permissive super dielectrics enable the pine cones to kiss noses of charge permissively, which climaxes in embedding into the longitudinal array, which is why that is the physics of ancestor phone calls.
Of course, of course. And when that expands all the way through our brain, at its max, at a bigger, but taking advantage of most of the potential that we have, I see how all our neurons, with their very specific functioning, each one of them, for instance, our pyramidal ones, mirroring into the pyramids, into the pyramid network, our rose hip neurons generating all that vacuum fluctuation in order to stabilize the hyper oscillation that can be happening within our pyramidal neural structure, and like how all this technology that works through the interferential wave reaches our mirror neurons that are the ones precisely that are capable to generate a higher to manifest actually the higher consciousness of how the universe functions through holofractographic spectrum,
Well,
you know?
it's a very creative thinking. First of all, it is absolutely clear that the right hemisphere and left hemisphere are part of an array. We call it net of fireflies or Indra's net. And you go from that little array inside your head uh, um, successfully to the bigger array of the longitudinal array when you lucid dream and die successfully. And transitioning between those two arrays requires that mirroring function because you have to set a phase conjugate mirror. The opposing mirrors have to be 180 degrees out of phase in order to generate the caduceus implosion to the still point. And it is access to the implosive still point, Planck, pine cones kissing noses, that enables you to embed in the longitudinal array. So it's all about the right kind of mirror, but it's a very particular kind of mirror, like the turning point for Nostradamus when he found out what kind of mirror to put on the bottom of his scrying cup, or when John Dee was phoning the ancestors, or the Olmec, they use an obsidian mirror. So it is about the mirror, but it's a very particular kind of mirror. It's literally a phase conjugate mirror with all the physics that implies.
You know,
And just to
now,
lastly say, we can prove that phase conjugation is the cause and reason perception exists. So once you understand that you have an eyeball, for example, kids who are seeing without their eyes, the first thing they see is a little vortex come to a point, and through that point, they see it as an eyeball because the phase conjugate point implosion makes a little black ball inside your head, which blindfolded kids perceive as an eyeball because it's the phase conjugate point.
hmm, I would love to open a topic. Because there are so many things coming to my mind right now. Uh, well, now that you were mentioning that eyeball, as you know, there is this blind spot in our eye. And there are many ways that I have translated that, as how you have already seen. It's my way of bringing things together. So if we have the 360 degrees, it generates a full circle. If we go through the vector equilibrium, which would be, let's say, a sort of 369, so then we are 9 degrees above our circle. Those 9 degrees would represent actually the range of the blind spot that leads us again to the 9, and then for me also leads us to a very powerful key in how to go beyond the field of predictability within the simulation, within the reality of simulation, that it works through.
I think, if a physicist were discussing this, they would emphasize that the blind spot is where the wiring behind the retina creates a little black hole in the connection between the retina and the brain. So it's a very specific kind of black hole. And I don't think a 9-degree angle actually would. And Tesla's bit about 3, 6, and 9. Well, now we know the physics of self-polarization of 9. Of course, 6 is the hexagonal stabilization of tetracubic symmetry. And it's true, permutations of 3 is the only origin of I Ching, because that's the only origin of DNA. So,
Yes.
3, 6, and 9, Tesla sort of had that right. But the wave mechanics of that, I think, all I'm saying is in order that we may have great discipline in our conversations, we must always understand the difference between numerology and physics. It's numerology until it actually predicts something a wave is going to do.
Yes, yes, I love it. Thank you for saying this. And I will show to you the image that I wanted to show to you about quantum entanglement, photonic quantum entanglement, which is here.
Yeah, it is about the donuts imploding on the left. That's good. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. So speaking about numerology and how it, goes into physics, here we have the 6. We could see the 6 and the 9. I know that my form of approach is yet this is how it got me to remember all the things that I do now and that I'm blessed to at some point confirm with grandiose minds as yours and as other physicists like Nassim, a good friend, and
Well,
Yeah.
it's true that if you needed to draw how two vortex as pine cones kiss noses enable all forms of phase conjugation and actually the origin of the mass itself, that in 2D, the yin and the yang symbol would be pretty useful, the centripetal versus centrifugal. So it's
Yes.
poetically, it's gorgeous.
Yes. And even if you see the 6 and the 9 reaching out to the a sixth form of perception, of dimensional perception, and the ninth form of dimensional perception, it's generating that torsion that brings them together. So, but I want to share with you, because I also approach a lot to the mitochondria. Here is a beautiful image of what would be, by the way, what I want to talk to you about, what they know as the virginal conception. I heard that you related it to the, for instance, giving the example of Archangel Gabriel agenda. And also one of the things that I saw in Egypt is that you see this image on the right.
Yeah. Yeah, it's proof that the Egyptians, actually it was the Anunnaki, because Thoth who ran Egypt, Thoth and Enki, who was Osiris, are the ones who actually taught the Egyptians. And it's proof that they knew what meiosis and mitosis was. It's obviously meiosis, mitosis. And it's true that the mitochondria are the connections between the imploding halves there. And it's true there's an optical superconductivity in the mitochondria, which is actually where the cell division is doing a dance of charge implosion oriented around a superluminal and longitudinal field, which it has to be stable at the center for meiosis and mitosis to proceed, really. So there's an invisible component of meiosis and mitosis, which is the longitudinal node around which the dance of cell division is taking place.
Yes, yes. Like for me, these two women are curing plasma, you
Well,
know,
actually,
to
they're preparing the sperm to inseminate the egg, because they knew what insemination was and they used it in their cloning extensively. In fact,
exactly, exactly,
Enki's
exactly.
Enki's other name, Nudimud, meant the cloner. He was a
Yes.
trained cloner.
Yes. And for instance, I tuned into the parthenogenesis, or how I say it, parthenogenesis, where the Parthenon comes from. And that I will explain to you this in a bit, because only male would be shown or are shown in the glyphs, not little girls, just little boys, which is kind of what happens with the bees form of asexual reproduction, which is the parthenogenesis, that they can only give life to male forms and not to female. Because if you go to the temples, you have the hators, the mothers, in the mamisis or mamises, and they are just breastfeeding males.
Well, there are a couple points to be made. The reason the Enlil Yahweh faction were afraid of women was because the Draco culture had Orion Queen Mag fear of women for many thousands of years. So every religion on earth started with fear of women. But second of all, very practically, we would mention that the Tegetan Pleiadians, which are very matriarchal, and most of their reproduction is parthenogenate, that is, they don't need men to reproduce. One byproduct of parthenogenesis is they only give birth to females. And there's some serious distortions in the Tegetan Pleiadian matriarchy because of that.
Yes, and thank you for mentioning that again, because that's what I wanted to say. Okay, so when we were talking about the brain, because here is the brain, I will explain in a bit and how I relate its connection to the heart, because so through the centrifugal forces, the range of the centrifugal forces, that's how you would relate the difference in the frequency from the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere.
Well, that drawing there of the heart, you have the aortal valve to the right, is a pretty good drawing also of the anu of the 7 spins outside, 5 spins inside. And the point to be made is the 7 spins is merely a representation of the 7 spin axes of a tetracubic array. and the 5 spins is pent. And the tetracubic array is the opposite of centripetal, and therefore the opposite of implosion. So everything hex in the flower of life, for example, will never be centripetal, but it's very good for stabilizing. So the centripetal versus the forces versus the stabilizing forces are always more than representative. They are the physics of tetracubic charge symmetry versus pent implosive symmetry.
Okay. How would you determine, for instance, the frequency that the amygdaloid body in the brain by the temporal lobe generates, like being in charge of generating the adrenaline, generating, amplifying the survival mode, not the survival instinct, yet the survival mode. How does the amygdaloid body, what's the frequency that it would be generating that at some point?
I mean, that's pretty well worked out in the physics of Kundalini. The low frequency sacrocranial pump fluids centered around the 0.1 hertz Mayer wave. A climax is at the top of the amygdala with the mouth of the snake brain, and then pumps those low frequency phonons. And when they implode, and we measured this in the ringing in the ear heard by bliss meditators in the physics of Kundalini documentaries at goldenmean.info/Kundalini, the ventricle liquid horns crystallize into a phonon, literally getting horny. That's conserved sexual energy, literally. And so the phonons of the sacrocranial pump, remember, if your spine liquid is pumping, it is clinically impossible to be depressed. So
Yes.
that implosion climaxes in the ventricle liquid horns crystallizing, and that's why Lucifer and Moses had horns. It merely indicated the climax of Kundalini.
Exactly. This is what
Which
I
is
have
focusing an
said.
implosive phonon on the amygdala. So the
Yes.
amygdala is delivering the raw material for the implosive phonon, but the implosive phonon between the ventricle liquid horns then implodes in the pineal, and that's where the high frequency longitudinal goes straight up and out.
Yes, for instance, when you talk about the horns, how I see it, I agree with everything that you have said. And for me, there is this very subtle layer of reality where the fornix, like around the ventricles that you have just said, generate a subtle spin, and they emit the light right through these points. As how also the pineal gland, instead of being in 90 degrees, would levitate 45 degrees right through our causal chakra or the
Well,
bindu.
actually, the top of the head gets hot and negative ion explosion palpable from there. And in many, including myself, Kundalini friends, the top of the head develops literally a point in the head shape itself from the intense pressure of the phonon liquid.
Yes, yes, beautiful. So, well, I just want to share with you what came to me when I was doing this, uh, like the heart as the vortex it is, and how when we unroll it, it just becomes half a donut.
Yes,
Then,
that's beautiful. Hmm.
then when we duplicate it energetically, then we are creating the full donut.
Right. It's amazing where you took the Anu, what we call the Anu at the left, and unpack it on the right. It's beautiful. We have all of those graphics are at 7arrows.net. And
Yes.
indeed, the perfect heart is the perfect Anu, which is the heart of hydrogen, the heart of the human, and the heart of the sun, because that is the heart of charge collapse, implosion, literally.
Beautiful. Well, this is how I perceive reality. This
It's
is how
gorgeous.
I.
They're very feminine and sensitive and evolved. And the books, when the Anu was first drawn by the clairvoyants, Leadbeater and Besant, it was decades before they proved they had found subatomic particle symmetry before physics got there. Actually, Leadbeater and Besant in the book Psi Perception of Quarks, a sequel to Occult Chemistry. So indeed, this is a beautiful nuclear physics. And the other part of this is inside Perception of Quarks, they saw the elemental beings that inhabit the subatomic particles are impish, mischievous, and alive. You see many pictures of Marae Zupa and the Theosophic, for example. On the other hand, those living subatomic plasma beings that inhabit those subatomic particles, if you put that material from living wood and living fabric, and you put it in aluminum or metal where the charge is isolated, not distributed, all the subatomic life force is gone.
Hmm.
So it's literally like the subatomic life force plasma itself is in pain, which is defined by opposite of being the opposite of distribution. And so all the subatomic particles are impus, joyful, and alive in nature. But you put that same material into a metal and steel building, and you got death everywhere.
Yes, yes. That's why this is very ironic when we I will put a little bit down now
Beautiful,
the present.
beautiful. I love your pictures. No, the drawings are wonderful. And it reminds me on the bottom right of the 7 layers of heart muscle from the Pettigrew dissections in the Steiner Fields of Form, Vortex of Life literature.
This one up, you say?
The bottom right, where you have muscle layers, and when you see it, there's actually 7 layers of muscle, and those
Yes.
7 layers of muscle are exactly in the 7 spin arrow symmetry axes of a tetrahedron, and that's how the heart muscle is built. You couldn't get a better squeeze, 7 layers, and inside you got 5 spins. So the human heart is a perfect implosion charge collapse stuff. In fact, electrically, the reason your heart beats and gets voltage from gravity is because it has the symmetry of implosive charge collapse built into it. That's where your heartbeat comes from. Tell your 5-year-old.
Exactly. And it's a spinning, it's a spinning. And
Well,
I don't
it's
know.
the imploding. Yes, the
Yes.
implosive spinning.
I would love to know what is because you were relating of course, also the plasma to the capability. I will just put it a little bit this now. Stop share. Okay.
You could turn off this. Yeah,
Yes.
go ahead.
Okay. So you were mentioning about how the benefits of the plasma, like we know regeneration, rejuvenation, actually infinite source of energy we can actually apply to that. How I tuning into, because I should, it's, well, you saw the image, but it's the Vitruvius, and
Yeah,
it's,
it
for
is.
me, it's not, we have the T, which is also like the false door in the Egyptians, which is the T. And here in the center part, we have our thymus gland.
Yes. And you thump the thymus, mea culpa, and the phonon awakens your immune system.
Exactly, exactly. So this is for me all related to being capable to generate that mirror into our heart that fulfills it, because it also leads me to the two Fibonacci, like that sense of the human that is incomplete and always needs to find someone to complete himself or herself. It's
Well,
beautiful to come together. Nevertheless, we have our own double
well,
Fibonacci. Yes.
yeah, the romance is that Tantra can aid the implosion. The physics, however, is that for most people who walk in thick rubber sneakers on metal buildings and metal sidewalks and never, ever connect with the Schumann or ground in their whole life, this decapitates the charge collapse, decapitates the life force, eliminates all clairvoyance, basically eliminates all bliss and spirituality. So, the book Earthing or Grounding is
Mhm.
actually the electrical physics of exactly what you're talking about, because only when you can implode charge collapse through that center do you connect the radio, actually. So people who live in tall metal poison buildings and never get access to Schumann or ground, they're literally destroying the souls of their children.
Hmm. It's very ironic how in some ancient civilizations, for instance, well, some Chinese emperors would have Mercury. They would have Mercury trying to achieve the
Well, the mercury in the pyramids served the same function as the mercury in the Vimana Nazi Bell Hanabu, which
yes.
was it amplified the phonon array of the implosive charge collapse. So pyramids without mercury produced less wireless free energy for the global grid, whereas pyramids with mercury actually propagated more longitudinal coherence because the mercury acted as a phonon lens. Now, if the mercury was made more conductive by embedding an iron powder with a wetting agent, which is why the Nazi mercury was red. But then also they introduced a mild radioactive component for quasi-superconductive. And that's what made the mercury vortex implosive enough to propagate longitudinal coherence out the center, incorrectly called vril, the only physics of gravity production.
Exactly. And I believe that the literal translation of those emperors, like saying, okay, if Mercury works in the pyramids, then perhaps Mercury will work if I drink it, to generate
well,
effects and trigger.
the alchemists were drinking their cinnabar. That's why the mad caliph was called mad, insane, when he sold 1/3 the mass of the Kaaba stone, because the alchemists were drinking it. Later, they made the projective powder, literally the philosopher's stone, of the same meteoritic Kaaba stone. And that's how John Dee and Kelly and even Fulcanelli. So the physics here is that the components of the charge collapse were the vehicle of the implosion. The only real meaning of alchemy is charge collapse. And if you get the charge collapse right, you are immortalized, which is why these dumb alchemists are always drinking their dumb mercury and dying and going nuts. And by the way, those who think that cinnabar, the mercury stone, is why the mercury was red at the center of the vortex are wrong. No, the cinnabar is wrong dielectric and the wrong piezo.
Wow. So then are you saying that also the red powder founded in
Kelly and
some
D
Mayan sarcophags, and the red powder that the pyramids were covered with, and then with mica, because they give this subtle finished touch. So that
it was all
was
about
not.
alchemy. But
Yes.
most of the gold in Egypt was made literally with alchemy. In fact, the mummification is a relatively good example. The natron salt was the super dielectric for implosive capacitance, and you could actually measure that could turn the flesh into a gold powder emulet, which is the reason mummy powder was served in every pharmacy in Europe for 300 years. It's not because the Egyptians were eating gold powder. No, it's because the physics of mummification is implosive capacitance, which is the alchemy of how human flesh literally became the gold powder emulet.
Well, now about that, because you mentioned the Egyptian, I want to show to you something, speaking now, relating this to plasma and to the stars, because for me, there were many reasons why in the ancient times they would be connecting with the stars. And if we take into consideration quantum tunneling and how an entangled universe functions, of course, this requires a lot of energy. Of course, this requires a lot of discipline and a state of coherence.
It requires the form of implosion which enables plasma projection, which they call the raising of the Jed. What they meant was that if piezo phonon compression was maximized around the body would emit a longitudinal coherent directional beam, wrongly called vril. They called the Ba from the Ka. The Ka was a transverse coherence. The Ba was a longitudinal coherence. And that's what they said went through the heart of the sun. And it's correct. The pyramid was, in effect, a squirt gun to enable the plasma to embed in the heart of the sun. It is about phase conjugation. That's what enables the implosive plasma projection. So the raising of the Jed is actually a golden ratio piezo physics, which enabled the aura. And that's why they would fire their pharaoh if the pharaoh couldn't make rain, because when the pharaoh's aura is projected into the heart of the sun, that is a primary planetary regulator. And that's why Tutankhamun was used. They used his blood for rain making, because after 1,000 generations of pharaohs, the children knew that the pharaoh is fired if he can't make the Nile flood on time. Tutankhamun was a rainmaker, and I inherited some of that memory, actually.
Beautiful. And now, well, beautiful, because then we have something connecting us, because I feel deeply connected with that stage of Tutankhamun, Akhenaten, all that. I feel that a lot of that wisdom is what we are bringing in now to
Yes.
use.
Exactly. Well, and the real politics was Tutankhamun was the name for Enlil, the Draco, Yahweh, and Atun, the sun god, was the name for actually Thothmosis, means sons of Thoth, which is the name of the royal line of Egypt, which is Thoth, Tahuti Ningishita, actually, who was the life design. He was the alchemy teacher originally for Enki called Ishka. And the physics of that, the caduceus being Hermes and Thoth, which is today called phase conjugation. So the physics of the phase conjugation that enables the propagation of the aura, that is the lesson of Egyptian alchemy, literally, which I call the physics of soul.com. And there we have about 20 documentaries that when the body has access to sufficient compression, sometimes called sacred space, then there is a sufficient conversion of the transverse EMF aura into the directional coherent longitudinal EMF, the physics of soul, and that enables you to inhabit the array, what the Aboriginals call the songline ancestor memory. So the physics of soul is absolutely the lesson of the Egyptian kings. It is literally the physics of soul. And the physics of soul says something very practical. Number one, get those damn Bluetooth Wi-Fi gadgets out of your kids, or within days, they ain't going to have a soul.
Yes,
I mean, it's practical.
yes, yes. And hmm, it's that's a very deep topic because
It's
it's so.
sobering. It's sobering. Until we know what a soul is, our planet is destined to succumb to AI. We must know what a soul is, or we cannot steer our AI or our tornadoes.
Thank you for saying that. Look, I want to share with you this image. I will put it in. This is what I translated from the Dendera.
Oh
I
yeah,
call it a space-time table, a space-time table. But from the
space-time table.
yeah.
Yeah. Well,
uh,
the ceiling at Dendera had a galaxy map, which was proof that those who lucid dreamed in that era could lucid dream the scale of the galaxy, and the spiral that inhabited that meant that when you grow up, you do not just inhabit stars, you inhabit galaxies, and bodies of that size are literally within our reach.
Indeed, indeed. And that's why when I started tuning into the how it's called the zodiac wheel, I could see it as quantum machinery that is dictating specific algorithms that if we are capable to translate, they are giving us an approach of this present moment.
Mm.
So this is what I translated from it. This is how I perceive reality. And this is why I know that everything is alive, because they are emanating all these beautifully simplistic and yet so complex forms that are actually mirroring into our cosmic nature. And you said like everything that you have said has been very important, yet you mentioned something about what we choose to mirror into. And that empathic form of perception, it's fundamental in order to strengthen our forces in unity and not in separation, because then
Mm.
we're focusing in what is expanding us.
It's beautiful. And to have empathy is literally the ability to embed, and you should choose to embed in that which is alive and not that which is dead. And by the way, this could be a perfect picture of Atlantean fire crystals, or actually more particularly, this could be a perfect picture of four lasers doing four-wave mixing to phase conjugate at the center, and the phase conjugate mirror, literally where the pine cone's kissing noses is the center super dielectric there. So you have a picture of how phase conjugate optics makes negantropy time reversal here also.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate this very much. I remember when I
Four
started.
fire crystals, four fire crystals.
Wow, I will write that down to have it very present. I use them and I activate this from the holofractographic field depending on the code. Sometimes I use like this quantum. I show you this space ship that I created to travel in our chat before having this beautiful meeting, that to travel in our brain and do very
It's
interesting
true.
unfoldings. I do this through frequency taken, from instance, from the frequency emitted from the microtubules networking in our neurons, and then I put some of my my voice frequencies, and then activate this with a specific purposes within the holofractographic field and communing with our geometrical body to do upgrades. So,
It, it
yes,
reminds me of the physics in a way of when you first leave your body and your longitudinal coherence node it's just like a tornado that needs to be steered. How do you steer when your aura leaves your body? They call it intent, but it's a very specific set of vector directions, like the physics of the Hebrew alphabet is a simple nest of the 7 spins of the spiral on the torus indexed by tetra. And so it's a vector set for a squirt gun series that makes your jets able to navigate your aura when you lucid dream and when you die. So the ability to steer a tornado is more than metaphor for if you can navigate your aura as you begin to lucid dream and astral travel, which is the beginning of having a soul.
it takes me to, now that you mentioned the Hebrew letters, it takes me to, there is this one of the books that I very much like, which is I will just with this image, where they talk about the mem and lam, which they say that if you
It is true. If you take the angle of the spiral on the torus that casts the shadow of the letter M, mix, match, mend, mate, mater, matrix, you
exactly
actually have the angle of the beginning of making a matrix. It's true.
exactly, and it's all there. They show
Yes.
how we connect and disconnect in a very subtle form, and if we are not aware, we keep on perpetuating a reality. So, for instance,
So
this is, yes,
ultimately we steer by choosing the angle to make donuts nest, which is the physics of the origin of Hebrew and Sanskrit. Those animations, by the way, are at goldenmean.info/DNA ring. And it's wonderful that you're seeing and drawing them so intuitively. I needed a computer to do most of my drawings. I admire the human nature of yours.
here I will zoom this. For instance, this is what's inspired from the Aztec calendar, and I
Right.
see that they were talking about wormholes,
Yes.
about,
Well,
and at
that was
some point,
Quetzalcoatl Veracocha, who actually was Thoth.
yeah, yes. Hmm. Well, I don't know if you have ever come to Mexico. There is this place in Amatlan de Quetzalcoatl where they say there is the portal of Quetzalcoatl and the window to heaven, and also the place where he was in a ceremonial, well, he was initiated, and it's a very magical place. The energy is, it's very interesting. But
So we
any,
worked
Mhm.
some with Maurice Cottrell on the lid of Palenque studies and the map of solar flares and all that work there. But indeed, that was a part of the story of Quetzalcoatl Veracocha, which was the story of Thoth, really. For example, the interpretation of lid of Palenque meant that he was telling us that when the solar flares pattern prevents human ovulation, they had to leave actually, and that human ovulation was radically affected by solar flare symmetries, which is a big lesson. It's that all fertility is ultimately the heart of the sun. And
Hmm,
on that note,
yes.
well,
And well, now that you mentioned the solar flares, what I'm expressing and trying to convey a lot now through the courses and talks that I give is that, because you know that when they say plasma is the fourth state of matter, then they automatically encapsulate it into
well,
matter,
that would,
you
but
know?
that
And
would,
then,
that's
yeah,
not really good physics. Plasma is a
I know.
name for a cloud. Plasma is a name for a cloud of charge. Cold plasma is where heat is not required to maintain the charge in the cloud. When that same charge, and remember, plasma is 99.999% of the universe, and when
Exactly.
that same cloud of charge plasma is compressed, namely rotates, that same cloud of charge stores the inertia, the only definition of mass, and time, the period of that same rotation. So it is literally a unified field. Plasma never was separate from mass. Mass is simply a compressed form of charge which has entered into rotation.
Exactly. That's why I express in other words, but like just envisioning that plasma, it's not just the matter that we would inherently relate it
No.
to. Plasma goes at different scales, and actually what plasma at a Planck scale would be would be that zero gravity, 0 point gravity, and then connecting to the ether. What would
Well,
you?
well, that's what PlanckFire.com means. Planck times golden ratio is the cause, that charge collapse is the cause of gravity, consciousness, life force, all negantropy, and perception. What that means is that when charge is able to compress to the Planck scale coherently and become longitudinal, that's when it becomes part of the array we call consciousness and gravity.
Beautiful. Yeah, and I really wanted to get it also in like very quantum physics terms because, as I told you, I love to unify. I believe in a
Well,
unified
the
quantum.
ultimate equation for quantum physics is Planck times integer exponents of golden ratio, predicting like 200 clear physical variables because that is charge compression, and charge compression is the reason consciousness and gravity and negantropy and life force exists. Implosive compression, gaining energy during charge collapse is the reason gravity and consciousness exist literally. So if we set ourselves up to do that, we live in nature, we get grounded, then we can gain energy during charge collapse. And by the way, then you don't even need food.
Yes, yes. I experienced that while living in Egypt.
Yeah, the
I
bliss.
I had one of
Yeah.
those not being able to breathe for a while, and my daughter wasn't there at that moment. But then I went through a full process of restoration and well, my circadian system, everything. I would just sleep 2 hours. I had to explain my irrational mind that it was okay, that I was not going crazy, that because my endorphins, my bliss, my joy was up to the top. I was
You
not.
were reliving your Egyptian memories. You know, I had a swoon experience in the gold sarcophagus of Tutankhamun similarly, actually. And that was a Kundalini trigger too. But well, this has been wonderful. I really appreciate, and I appreciate the fact that you have taken a lot of the physics that we've been working with into a much more human and artistic realm. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And you know, sometimes we say, well, have you measured it and what's the frequency? But at the same time, your intuition has expanded this language beautifully. So I think the synergy here is wonderful. I thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you. I appreciate you, and I appreciate this beautiful gathering and all the energy that we have generated from it, and may it also bless all the people that get to watch this transmission.
Exactly. To be continued, we will become a shareable wave together. Thank you.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay.
Thank you.
Blessing. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
See you again. Bye.
Till
Bye.
next time.